Hey, Dr. C here with you. So this is a really important topic, and I'm excited to go into this in good detail with you. This is all about iron. You know, people with thyroid disease, it's really common that they've got symptoms that just don't get better. It can be things like the hair loss, or the fatigue, or the insomnia, or the digestive problems. And, they try really hard to get to the right thyroid level, or cutting out all the bad foods. And sometimes the symptoms just persist. And in many cases, they even think iron might be the culprit, and they'll eat differently or take some supplements and not see it really improve. And then they'll look at their blood levels, and the conventional doctor says, oh, you're fine, there's no problem. And yet their ferritin seems unusual. Maybe it's even very high and it's not clear. So I'm really jazzed to dive into this topic and help make some sense out of it for you. For starters, let me just talk a bit about iron itself. So, we see like iron gates and cast iron pans, and it's an element that has a lot of useful chemical properties. It's also a strong electron donor, so it rusts, it oxidizes pretty easily. And the good part about that is it can temporarily bind with oxygen, get it from our lungs to our blood, move it throughout our body, and give our cells the oxygen they need. The negative is that it oxidizes, it's a source of free radicals. So we need some, but we can't get too much. So the body has this really exacting system of calibrating how much iron we have, and it adjusts how we absorb it to compensate. And when things work well, the little bit that we always lose is compensated for by what we assimilate from our diet. We always lose some by breaking down our red blood cells. The red blood cells have hemoglobin, and that's a pigment, like a paint. Kind of a funny thing, that's almost just like chlorophyll, which is the green pigment or paint in plants, but hemoglobin has iron at the center rather than magnesium at the center. So yeah, we've got this red paint in our blood cells, and blood cells wear out after about 120 days. And we do our best to reuse that iron and recycle the hemoglobin. And so the leftovers of that process is what makes our poop brown. So we're pooping out some iron on a regular basis. There's also some that we shed from our sweat, from our urine a little bit, and also just skin cell sloughing. And the body's carrying about 5,000 to 7,000 milligrams of iron at a given point in time. An adult is. Now, if you're a menstruating woman, you're also going to lose some iron with your regular menses. And that can be an additional 30 to 60 milligrams of iron per month. So we run the math, and you're losing half to a milligram just by being alive and just by recycling blood cells. And then you could lose an additional milligram or so if you're menstruating. And the diet itself, we're going to average about 15 or 20 milligrams per day from our diet. And it surprised me, but there's certainly a lot of difference in the type of iron in plant foods and animal foods. But the upshot of it is that we can still make do with the iron from plant foods. So even if you're vegetarian, you're still going to get about that much iron. You can get less, but you can still get enough to usually stay caught up. But of what we get there, we're absorbing a small percent of that. So we end up netting about 3 to 5% of our dietary iron gets absorbed. And that ends up being about a milligram or so. So we're losing about a milligram, and we're absorbing about a milligram. And as long as those things stay in check, we're fine. But if we absorb a little bit less, if our diet has none of the iron-rich foods, if we're losing a bit more, or if we're assimilating less iron, we can fall behind. And what happens is that 5,000 to 7,000 milligram container of iron that we have, a lot of that is ferritin, which is a stored version of iron, mostly in the liver. So a lot of that ferritin gets depleted. And that 5,000 to 7,000 milligrams, we might only have, let's say that 5,000 is your magic number. You might have 4,250. You might have 4,500. You might have 3,000, but you're down by a lot. So let's think again about the diet real quick. If the diet can give us about a milligram or so, or a couple milligrams, how much surplus can we get from the diet? When things all work perfectly, we might gain an extra half a milligram from rich dietary sources. So that means that if we're behind, we can get caught up at the rate of about 0.5 milligram of iron per day. That's not much when you hear that you could be behind by 500 or 2,000 milligrams, right? So if you're 500 milligrams low, you're getting ahead at 0.5 milligram per day. Well, that's going to be 1,000 days to get caught up. And the thing about iron that's not intuitive is that when you're low in it and you have symptoms, those symptoms may not budge until you're all the way topped off again. That's a really important point. It's not that now here's some iron again, you can use that. No, the first thing you do is pay your debts. The first thing you do is go to build up that storage. So yeah, you may not feel the benefit until you've really built that storage up again. Briefly about plant versus animal irons. We call this heme and non-heme. So animal foods have both heme and non-heme iron. Plant foods have non-heme iron. And in general, the non-heme iron, we absorb less of it than we absorb of the heme iron, but they overlap. You know, when we absorb a lot of non-heme iron or a little of heme iron, those are the same amounts. And so the plant foods, we can absorb more when we need to. The heme iron, we can't really absorb less when we need less. That's the wrinkle. If we need less iron and we're getting a lot of heme iron sources, we can't block that out as well. But plant foods, we can go way down. If we're set on iron, we can not absorb it. And this is rare, but there are some cases in which people do over-absorb iron. There's things like hemochromatosis. So now let's talk about, you know, deficiencies, anemias, all that stuff. Here's a common wrinkle. Someone can be low in iron, they can have symptoms from that, and yet their regular doctor will say, oh, you're not anemic, this is not relevant for you. Well, that can be a situation where everyone's right. So we have iron deficiency anemia. And the cycle is that when you have too little iron, the first thing is your stores start to get compromised. You've got less iron in savings. If that keeps going, eventually you can't make as much hemoglobin, and hemoglobin starts getting low. Now, if that keeps going, eventually you can't make red blood cells, and the blood cells start to get low. That's the third stage, right? Not the first stage. So anemias are defined by clear deficits of hemoglobin with or without a compromise in blood cell formation. That's second and third stage, right? First stage is storage compromised. So that's been called an LID, or latent iron deficiency, latent iron deficit, and you're not anemic. You still have adequate hemoglobin. You do have adequate blood carrying capacity. But here's the thing, iron does a lot of things besides that. Thyroid peroxidase, for example, that is an iron-dependent enzyme. When that enzyme is not fully operational, your body can't form or activate thyroid hormones as well as it ideally would. And that's one of over 100 iron-dependent enzymes that's in the human body. So we need it for lots of things. And the first state, when the stores get low, people get symptomatic. They don't feel well. Now, the other thing we've got latent iron deficiency. So latent as in it's an iron deficiency, it's not yet manifest as anemia. So LID. Then we have IDA, the iron deficiency anemia. We also have anemia of chronic disease. So there are situations in which the body has few red blood cells or less hemoglobin as part of an illness response. Sometimes when there's chronic inflammation or chronic infection, it compromises our oxygen carrying capacity. The difference between it and latent iron deficiency or iron deficiency anemia is generally that ferritin elevates. Now, why would that be? Well, the body is trying hard to suck iron out of the blood in cases of chronic disease. There are some times when it's not helpful, but in most cases it's done on purpose. And for example, in the case of some infections, many bacteria, they need access to iron to really grow well. So your body takes that away. It pulls the iron out of your blood and it stocks it all away in storage. So if ferritin is high, but circulating levels are low. So that's the big difference. If ferritin is well above range, we're starting to think more about an anemia of chronic disease. And in those cases, it's not always helpful to try to offset that or supplement with iron. Sometimes it's counterproductive, but that does take personalized guidance to sort that out. Now, we think about ferritin as well in its numbers. So we've got this range of like 10 to 200 for ferritin on your blood tests. And that's so broad, right? So when you're too high, that can be from chronic disease, And actually, fatty liver is one of the more common causes of that elevating too. Now, what does it mean to have it be low? Well, if you're below range, that's low, straightforward. But you can be in range and still be at a place to where you're not feeling well in ways that could get corrected for the benefit of iron. And that threshold, this is kind of nuanced too, but it seems that there's a certain level of deficiency to cause symptoms, then there's another level to reverse symptoms. So here's some numbers, for example. They've shown that fatigue or hair loss in those with thyroid disease, you might need to dip below 50 to have those symptoms show up. However, you might need to get above 100 to see those symptoms go away. You see that difference there? So people can often have symptoms that show up with a minor deficit, but they don't clear up until they've really resolved that and filled those stores up again. So some references argue that 30, 50, somewhere around there is a lower threshold of ferritin by which symptoms start. But with thyroid disease, there's so much overlap between iron and thyroid hormone. There is some data arguing that you need to move above 100 to reverse those symptoms. They may not have started when you hit 99, but they might not go away till you get above 99. So that's entirely possible. So now let's just talk a little bit about why it is that people get low. Well, there could just be too little in the diet. There are some really good plant sources of iron, a lot of options that way. So there is that though. People may not be consuming some of these higher iron foods. That's not the most common reason. One of the more common ones is going to be just menstrual loss. If you're a woman and your periods are anything more than light, it wouldn't be the least bit unusual for you to fall behind. You might be losing 40, 50, 60 milligrams of iron a month on your period. And now that's going to be adding an extra almost 2 milligrams per day on top of what you lose just from recycling your blood cells. And that's more than your diet can sustain. You just will fall behind from that. Another thing that's counterintuitive is that being anemic can make your periods heavier. So some women get into a vicious cycle to where they've lost enough blood to where they're going to have heavier periods and lose more blood and so on and so on. There's also times in which blood is being lost in ways that are not obvious. We think about chronic inflammatory bowel disease. That's a tricky one because the inflammation in the gut can hurt both assimilation of iron and it can speed loss of blood. So they can get a double whammy. But those can cause excess loss. And then we think too about occult colorectal cancers, hidden colorectal cancers. If a 50-year-old guy was suddenly anemic for no other reason, that would be a high suspicion. We'd want to make sense out of that and get a good reason for that. Now, then we think also about poor assimilation of iron. Let's say you're not losing too much, or let's say you're getting enough in your diet, but it's not making its way into your bloodstream. Well, some big things for that. Celiac disease is one. That is more common in those with thyroid disease. And it's sort of thing where you want to know if you have celiac disease or not. Because if you do, kind of sort of avoiding wheat is not going to cut it. You need full avoidance. And also you want to make sure that you're not having progressions and risks towards colorectal cancers. And the other thing too is that celiac disease, this is bizarre, it's not caused by wheat. It's worsened by wheat intake, but the thing you're attacking, the glutaminase, that's an enzyme your body uses all over the place for things that have nothing to do with wheat. So you're attacking a lot of stuff, and you want to be aware of that. So celiac disease is not just about wheat, so it's good to get a solid diagnosis either way. Other things we think about, one of the big ones is atrophic autoimmune gastritis, also called thyroid gastritis. What's happening in this case is that the autoimmune response is going to be causing a damage to the stomach itself. And in that case, the stomach becomes unable to assimilate certain nutrients. And there's a sequence to where the first stage is often this latent iron deficiency, this LID. The second stage is often overt anemia. And then in the third stage, we're also seeing B12 anemias on top of it, also called pernicious anemia. But this is common stuff. This is probably 30–40% of people with thyroid disease that have this. And the earlier stages are not obvious, and they don't always cause symptoms. They can cause symptoms like IBS, gas bloating, heartburn. So that's the other part of it, is it can also be a source of some of the unexplained symptoms of those with thyroid disease. But this is something that if you are low in iron, if it doesn't want to come up, if you're prone to digestive symptoms, it's really good to check for. This is one of the many things that I'm just crazy proud of my doctors for is, we catch someone that has this almost every week. And it's necessary. If they don't get diagnosed, they have perhaps no obvious symptoms, and they are at higher risk for stomach and esophageal cancer. With good monitoring, doesn't have to be, it can be managed really well and those things can be prevented, but you've got to know about it first off. And in most cases, that's just not known. So yeah, really good to catch that. So I want you also to think through about the testing. This is important to screen for your iron levels. Full panels will include ferritin, your percent saturations, your iron binding capacity, your blood count, and also your serum iron. And the context of that, you can make good sense out of where you are. There's a blog post that goes with this video. And in the blog post, I've made a map on which tests you want to do, what are your optimal levels for all those tests, and what do they mean? You can put it all together and say, are you at this latent iron deficiency? Which stage? There's a couple stages. Are you iron deficient anemic, moderate or severe? Or is this more of a sign of an anemia of chronic disease? And the cool thing too is that you can know if you're in one of those categories. Then if you look at that and consider your body weight, I also made a chart you can look at that'll tell you how much your total iron deficit is. How many milligrams you probably need to get caught up again. So let's say you are low, and what do you do about that? Well, to improve your absorption of iron, you'd want to have your meals with iron-rich foods with enough vitamin C and with a small enough amount of iron binders, which biggest things there are going to be dairy foods, and then also wine and caffeine. So teas and coffee specifically, they have polyphenols. These are things that can limit iron absorption. You'd also want to know if you had chronic H. pylori or if you had the thyrogastric inflammation, the atrophic gastritis. That's something that can also make it harder to assimilate. And then we think about correcting iron and, pills and whatnot. So iron pills, there's none are perfect. I'll put that out there. My favorite is iron bisglycinate. That's one that I use on our store and I recommend. And it's a type that's a pretty good balance between being well absorbed and not as much as an intestinal irritant. Probably around 15% of people will not tolerate any version of oral iron supplements. If they take a high enough dose to be useful, they just won't do well with that. Now, recent papers have shown some pretty cool stuff. It turns out that there is a binding protein that helps assimilate iron that takes about a day and a half to recharge. So once you take a substantial dose of iron, you probably won't assimilate much more from supplements for the next day and a half or so. And the practicalities of that are pretty big for those that are prone to side effects. The trick is you would do your full dose on alternating days. So my favorite recommendation for our iron chelate is to do between 3 to 6 capsules in one dose every other day. It's better absorbed away from meals, so better to be taken by itself, but every other day. And oddly enough, it's no less effective than it would be if you took that same amount twice a day. So yeah, so 4 pills in 2 days is the same as 1 pill over 2 days. But yeah, 3 to 6 pills per total dose. And rather than taking, let's say you're taking 3 pills every other day, that'll work as well as taking 12 pills in 2 days. So rather than 3 pills twice a day, back-to-back days, 3 pills in 1 dose every other day will be as effective. Now, difference between 3 and 6, that's going to be stomach tolerance. If you're doing okay on 6, that'll be more effective and more efficient for you. You can net about 5 to 15 milligrams of iron absorption from pills. You can get about that much in. Much past that, additional amounts won't be assimilated. So take a peek at the chart, see what your iron deficit is, and if you're not even on the chart, you might do okay just to add in some more dietary iron and stay caught up. If you are low and you're low by 500 milligrams, if things go perfectly for pills, you might be able to top that off in the course of about, a month and a half or so? Not totally unreasonable if you can take full doses and tolerate them well. But iron infusions have their place, and they're really awesome. We use a version of iron now that's non-allergenic, and it's just a phenomenal thing to see someone who's been anemic and had insomnia, fatigue or mood changes, memory loss for years, and no joke, overnight they're completely built up again. that deficit of 1,000 milligrams or something, in the course of 2 infusions that each is like 15 minutes, you're done. So like back-to-back days, 2 15-minute small volume infusions, you're done. You're all set. And those that do have atrophic gastritis, they'll not get built up by supplements. They will just not get caught up again with iron pills. That's often true for those that have had heavy periods, those that have celiac disease, those that have an inflammatory bowel. They're not going to get there by pills. So if you got a big deficit, or if there's some other reason causing malabsorption, it likely will take the infusions. They're easy. They're really safe. They're crazy effective. And let's say worst case scenario, your iron loss cannot be stopped. Let's say that it's just something to where you've got to wade through menopause for your periods, or there's some chronic condition that you can't really stop or resolve, like inflammatory bowel or the atrophic gastritis. In those cases, you can still have your stores built up, and you might need to top off every few years. It's really not a big thing. You're not doing frequent treatment. So it's just awesome to have that solution available. And I've heard the experience described as like putting on a warm blanket. So quick overview there on iron. Please go check out the blog post. I put all this in much more detail, crazy well referenced. And yeah, I've got lots of charts and graphs. You can play with some math and look at your labs and make sense of exactly where you're at. And so often, symptoms that don't work well unless someone's overdosed on their thyroid, they're often low in iron. And even if you feel better when you're overdosed on your thyroid, it's not safe. So find the cause, treat the cause, and if iron's the culprit, it can be treatable. People so commonly have thought it was the cause for good reason, but then taken pills, changed their diet, not seen it change, and kind of given up on the whole endeavor and said, well, what else can I do? Maybe it's lying, maybe it's something else. This is often it. Look at your labs. If you've not been checked, check yourself. I've given you data on how to know what to test, what your levels should look like, what your results mean, and how much iron deficit you would have, and then how to fix that. All right, Dr. C with you. Take awesome care of yourself, and I'll see you real soon.